My father married up to Cherokee. My mother's people were ashamed of me.
Well, welcome back. This is chapter 17, the South and West Transformed. And today we're going to talk about how the government did several things to get the West settled at the expense of the Native Americans and everybody who lived out in the West at that time. In 1893, Frederick Jackson Turner wrote a thesis. He was a professor at University of Wisconsin eventually, and he said that in the Turner thesis that the frontier is closed. We moved westward, and we'll talk about some of those things that led up to that during this time. But he said at one time that the West encouraged democracy and individualism. It was kind of a safety valve for people who left the crowded eastern cities and moved westward. But by 1893, he said that that was no longer necessarily true, that the West was slowly filling up in different cities, and you couldn't tell at one point where the West actually started. And one of the things the government did to try to get people to move west was they took land from the Indians, put the Indians on reservations, and they tried to encourage settlement by giving away land cheap or for free. The Homestead Act of 1860 was passed, and you could get 1862, and you could get 160 acres of land if you lived on it for 5 years. That's all you had to do. And so people moved west, and of course it was a lonely life because often your neighbors lived sometimes 50, 60, 100 miles away from you. And the government then also started A&M colleges, agriculture and mechanical schools, because of the Morrill Land Act that was passed to encourage people to go into those fields, and you can see some of the effects of that today with places like Texas A&M that still exist. Then they built the railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad would connect the East and the West. A lot of the work that was done on the railroad was done by the immigrants that newly came to the country. Many Irish immigrants moved westward from the east to work on the railroad, and many Chinese immigrants moved from the west to the east. And eventually they would meet in Utah, 1869, and the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. And then at that point, of course, the Indians looked out and saw settlers, soldiers, and they knew that it was just a matter of time before things were going to turn bad for most of them. We had, as time went on, I think we had people often wanted to reminisce about the old times and the old West, and Buffalo Bill started a Wild West show where he hired different people. Annie Oakley was one. She was a young lady who was quite a sharpshooter with a gun. And they tried to emulate what happened in the West by taking a kind of a traveling circus on the road, although quite often it wasn't very accurate in their depiction. We had cattle drives too during this time. After the Civil War, there were many cows in South Texas that were going to be driven to places like Missouri, and then eventually to Chicago, to the slaughter market, to cattle market to be slaughtered. And up until the Civil War, many people didn't eat a lot of beef. It really was pork and chicken, but they developed a taste for beef, and guys like Charles Goodnight from Texas got in on the ground floor by rounding up these cattle and taking them north. Of course, during the same time, we had another animal that was slowly disappearing from our American landscape, and that was the buffalo. Goodnight was a little bit concerned because the buffalo population went from about 30 million at one time down to 1,000 in North America. And Goodnight decided he was going to try to save the buffalo by mating it with cattle, and the result became a cattle-o. Some call it a beefalo, but it was, from all indications, quite an ugly animal. Somebody once said it took on the worst features of both animals. We also, at this time, had the federal government and soldiers. After the Civil War, many of these guys were out of work. The war was over, and they had to, I guess they had to find something for them to do, so many of them moved westward to round up the Indians to put them on reservations. And they passed a law called the Dawes Severalty Act, and that was to assimilate the Indians. So they would round them up, put the Indians on reservations, cut their hair, change their culture, change their language, religion, and basically take away their identity, and try to take over the natives. Of course, a lot of the reservations were in Oklahoma and places like that. Then we had an event in 1876 called the Little Bighorn. It was Custer's last stand. General Custer went there to get the Indians and eventually move them to reservations. And Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse had a different idea. There was gold in that area, and they wanted them out of there. And Custer and 600 men were surprised by the number of Indians that attacked him. They were caught down in a valley, and it was kind of a bad strategic move by Custer and his men, and they ended up losing. Custer died along with all of his men, but it was really, we call it Custer's last stand, but it was really the last big battle that the natives would win. 1890 would be when they finally would be defeated in a terrible massacre at Wounded Knee, and that would pretty much be the end of the Native Americans, as many of them were either killed or moved to reservations. I want to close with a couple thoughts, a couple questions to think about. We look at how the West was settled, and is America still a place where there's room for growth? I mean, we look out west, and is there a lot of land that still can be settled by people? We often see a lot of these cities like Houston that are crowded. Is the West still somewhat of a safety valve for that idea? Another thing to think about is we've had a change in our food habits from one generation to the next. We go back to the Civil War when people started eating beef around that time and after, and we moved into a time, I think, when a lot of people planted gardens and raised their own food and grew their own crops. Then we moved into processed food and fast food, and now we've got people that I guess in some cases are vegans even. But what's the effect been on our changing eating habits over time, and what do we see, I guess, in the future? When we defeated the Indians in the 1800s, we killed their food supply. The buffalo were killed, and things would change with them forever. I guess the last thing to think about is, the treatment of Indians. We've moved them to reservations. The Indians make up about 1% of our population today. Is there a solution, a fair solution to the Indian situation? We look at some of the problems that they face today with high rates of alcoholism, high school dropouts, teen pregnancy, drug abuse, high unemployment. There's probably no other group that has suffered in this country more than the Native Americans. Is there anything else that we can do, or is throwing money at the situation not going to help matters?